There's something about being out in the middle of nowhere with people you trust that makes you feel untouchable, like nothing bad can happen because you're surrounded by familiar faces, the ones who have laughed with you, cried with you, survived all the bullshit life throws at you. That was the feeling we were chasing when we planned this trip. A long weekend, just the four of us, me, Jake, Leo, and Emma, back together again, deep in the Colorado wilderness. No work emails, no phone calls, no responsibilities, just the trees, the fire, and the kind of silence you don't get in the city. We should have known better. The Blackstone National Forest wasn't exactly a popular spot. There were campgrounds, sure, but most people didn't venture this deep. It was too remote, too quiet. Perfect for what we wanted. We drove out on a Friday afternoon, following winding dirt roads until we reached the clearing we had picked out weeks before. It was beautiful. Dense trees surrounding an open space, a stream trickling nearby, the scent of pine thick in the air. We set up camp fast, cracking beers and laughing about stupid shit from our college days. The sun sank lower, turning the sky shades of orange and pink, and the firelight flickered across our faces. It felt like we had stepped outside of time itself. We roasted hot dogs, told old stories, let the weight of everyday life fade away. But something was off. I noticed it first. This subtle shift in the air, like the woods were listening. The trees stood too still, their shadows stretching too far as the last light disappeared. And then I saw him. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, tall, thin, watching. The fire crackled, and my stomach twisted. He wasn't moving, just standing there, half grin in the dark, his face obscured. I swallowed hard and nudged Jake, who was mid-loft. "What?" he asked, but when he followed my gaze, his smile faded. Leo and Emma turned next, their faces illuminated by the fire's glow. None of us spoke. We just sat there, frozen, staring back at the figure. "Hey," Jake finally called out. His voice was steady, but I could hear the tension underneath. "You all right, man?" Nothing. No response, no movement, just those eyes, catching the firelight glinting like an animal's. My pulse hammered in my ears. "Probably a hiker," Leo muttered, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. No one hikes this far in without a pack, without gear, and no one just stands there watching strangers without saying a damn word. "Can we help you?" Emma called, her voice sharper than usual. Still nothing. Then, just as suddenly as we had noticed him, he stepped back, not turning, not breaking eye contact, just fading into the darkness, swallowed by the trees. Gone. The fire popped, sending a spray of embers into the night air, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "That was weird," Jake said. Understatement of the year. "Weird," Emma repeated, voice tight. "That was straight up creepy." Leo forced a laugh, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe he didn't see us." "Bullshit," I muttered. He was staring right at us. There was nothing else to say. We tried to shake it off, forcing conversation, trying to bring back the lightness from before, but the mood had shifted. The fire didn't feel warm anymore. The woods weren't peaceful. Every rustle in the trees sent my nerves on edge. By midnight, we called it a night. The tents felt too thin, too fragile. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the fabric above me, listening to the wind whisper through the pines. Every sound was magnified, the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, and then footsteps, soft, slow, circling the tent. My breath caught in my throat. I turned my head toward Jake's tent, just a few feet away. "Jake?" I whispered. No answer. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I stayed awake for hours, heart pounding, waiting for something to happen, but eventually exhaustion won out, dragging me into a restless sleep. The second night. We should have left that morning, but we didn't. We laughed about it over breakfast, convincing ourselves we'd been paranoid. Maybe it was a lost hiker, maybe just a shadow playing tricks on us. Jake joked that we should have invited the guy over for s'mores. No one laughed. The day passed uneventfully. We hiked a few trails, fished at the stream, tried to pretend nothing had happened. But when the sun dipped low again, the unease crept back in. That night we built the fire bigger, brighter, as if that would keep whatever was out there away. It didn't. He came back, Leo saw him first this time. 1 second we were talking, the next his face went pale. His beer slipped from his fingers, spilling into the dirt. I turned. He was closer now, standing just outside the reach of the firelight, close enough that I could make out more details. His clothes were all wrong. Too heavy for the mild weather, ragged at the edges. His skin looked pale, almost gray. And his face? That smile. Subtle. Wrong. Like it wasn't meant to be there. Dude, Jake started, standing up. What the hell do you want? The man didn't move. I didn't blink. Do you hear me? Jake stepped toward him. Say something or get the hell out of here. Still nothing. Emma grabbed my arm, her fingers ice cold. We need to go, she whispered. She was right. Every instinct in my body screamed to run. Then he moved. Not forward, not backward, just sideways. Sliding along the edge of the darkness, never breaking eye contact, his body shifting unnaturally through the trees. The fire crackled, but I felt no warmth. That's when we saw the footprints, deep in the dirt around our tents, circling, fresh. We hadn't heard them. I grabbed my bag, my mind made up. We're leaving, now. No one argued. We packed frantically, stuffing what we could into our packs. The fire burned low, shadows growing taller. The man, he was still there, still watching. And then, the moment we stepped toward the car, he moved. Fast, too fast. A blur of motion into the trees, deeper into the dark. Gone. We ran. The car had never felt so far away. My breath came in ragged gasps, my pulse hammering so hard I could feel it in my skull. Footsteps followed us, distant but steady, echoing through the woods. We threw our gear in, locked the doors, and Jake gunned the engine. The tires spun in the dirt before catching, and we peeled out of there, the headlights cutting through the dark. No one spoke. Not until we hit the main road, miles from the campsite. Emma's voice was barely a whisper. What the hell was that? None of us had an answer. All I know is that I still dream about that weekend. I still wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced I can hear footsteps outside my window. I don't go camping anymore, and I never go near Blackstone National Forest. The thing about fear is that it never really leaves you. It clings to you like the dampness of a cold night in the woods. After hearing Sophia's story about the Blackstone National Forest, I swore I'd never go camping again. But time dulls fear. We tell ourselves that those were isolated incidents, freak events in an otherwise orderly world. That's what I told myself when Rachel suggested a family camping trip. It'll be good for us, she said. The kids will love it. And she was right. Emily and Ethan had been begging to go camping for months. I always found excuses. Work, weather, some vague feeling I couldn't explain. But when Rachel showed them pictures of Clearwater Creek, a secluded campground nestled in the heart of the Oregon wilderness, they were ecstatic. I couldn't say no. Fine, I said, forcing a smile. Let's weekend. No more, the kids cheered. Rachel kissed my cheek. I tried to ignore the knot tightening in my stomach. We left on a crisp Friday morning, the car packed with gear we hadn't used in years. The road climbed higher with every mile, the air growing thinner, the trees pressing closer. The kids sang loudly in the back seat, their voices mixing with static from the radio. Rachel chatted about the trails she'd researched. I nodded along but barely heard her. My mind kept circling back to Sophia's story, the watcher, the footsteps, the eyes. You're quiet, Rachel said, squeezing my hand. Just thinking about work, I lied. The road turned to gravel, winding through a dense corridor of pines. After another mile, the campground entrance appeared, a faded wooden sign with chipped paint. Welcome to Clearwater Creek. Enjoy nature safely. Someone had scratched something into the wood beneath the words. Don't listen to the whispers. The kids spotted it immediately. That's creepy, Emily said, wrinkling her nose. Probably just some bored kid trying to scare people, Rachel said quickly. Come on guys, let's find our campsite. The kids ran ahead, excitement overriding caution. I lingered by the sign, running my fingers over the carved letters. The edges were old, weathered. It hadn't been done recently. Coming, Nathan. Rachel called. I forced myself to turn away and followed her. The campsite sat beside the creek, a flat patch of ground with just enough space for the tent. The water shimmered under the afternoon sun, cold and clear, bubbling over smooth rocks. We pitched the tent while the kids threw stones into the water. The air smelled of pine and wet earth, crisp and clean. For a while, the unease in my chest faded. By dusk, we had a fire going. The flames crackled as we roasted hot dogs and marshmallows. The kids begged for scary stories. I gave them a silly one about a candy-stealing hermit. They laughed, eyes flicking toward the woods, half expecting the hermit to appear. Rachel leaned against me. See? This isn't so bad. The firelight danced in her eyes. I smiled and kissed her hair. The woods, so dark beyond the fire's glow, still felt vast and watching. But I didn't say anything. We crawled into the tent around 11 p.m. The kids fell asleep instantly. The creek hummed in the background, soothing and steady. I closed my eyes, willing myself to relax. The whisper woke me some time later. At first, I thought it was just the water. I held my breath and listened. Nathan? I sat up, pulse slamming into my throat. Rachel stirred beside me. I gripped her arm. Nathan, what is it? She whispered. The whisper came again. Nathan? The sound wasn't coming from the creek. It was coming from the other side of the tent wall. I fumbled for the flashlight and clicked it on. The beam wobbled across the nylon walls. Outside, the whisper came again, clearer this time. Let me in, Rachel gasped. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and aimed it at the tent door. The zipper was still closed. The voice didn't sound like the breeze. It sounded human, dry and brittle, like leaves crushed underfoot. The kids shifted in their sleeping bags. Rachel pressed a finger to her lips. We listened. The whispering had stopped, but footsteps crunched softly outside. Slow, deliberate steps, circling us. I swallowed hard. Who's out there? My voice cracked. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence. My heartbeat roared in my ears. Rachel squeezed my hand. I kept the flashlight pointed at the zipper, half expecting it to slide down. Minutes passed, then the footsteps retreated, fading into the trees. We stayed awake until the first light of dawn. The kids woke up groggy but cheerful. Rachel and I didn't say a word about the whisper. We kept the day busy, fishing, hiking, playing games, anything to keep from talking about what happened. By sunset, exhaustion pulled us back toward the fire. The air had grown colder, sharper. The creek seemed louder, more restless. Rachel stared into the flames. That voice, it knew your name. I didn't respond. I didn't know how. We decided to turn in early. I triple-checked the tent zippers, then lay down next to Rachel. She held my hand under the blankets. I tried to stay awake, but sleep dragged me under. The zipper sound cut through the silence. My eyes flew open. The tent flap was moving, the zipper sliding down an inch at a time. The flashlight was by my hip. I grabbed it, aimed it at the entrance, and hit the switch. The beam caught the zipper halfway down, and something beyond it. A face hovered just outside the mesh, skin pale and stretched tight over bone, hollow black eyes that seemed endless. Lips cracked and slightly parted. Let me in, it whispered. Rachel stifled a scream. I threw myself toward the zipper and yanked it down, flashlight beam stabbing into the night. Nothing. The ground outside was wet with mud. A trail of footprints led from the trees to the tent and back again. Rachel scrambled to wake the kids. I grabbed the car keys and the backpack. The kids were still half asleep as we hauled them outside. My flashlight swung wildly across the campsite. The woods were empty. The footprints stopped just beyond the trees. We sprinted to the car. I unlocked the doors, shoving everyone inside. The headlights carved tunnels through the darkness. As I jammed the key into the ignition, Rachel gasped. She pointed toward the creek. He stood there, thin, still, his skin stark white in the headlights, his eyes locked on mine, his mouth stretched into a smile. The engine roared to life. I slammed it into gear and tore down the gravel road. The headlights bounced wildly, illuminating the endless trees. In the rearview mirror, I saw him step onto the road. He didn't move, just watched us go. We didn't stop driving until sunrise. We parked at a gas station outside some small town. Rachel cradled the kids in the back seat while I tried to steady my breathing. A sheriff's deputy came by when I called 911. He listened to my story with a furrowed brow. "Clearwater Creek?" he asked. "Yeah." His jaw tightened. He took off his hat and rubbed his scalp. "You're lucky," he said quietly. "Why?" "You're not the first to report something like this. We've never caught anyone, never found tracks, just stories." He looked at me. "You're smart to leave." He handed me his card and walked away. We never went back. We never even talked about it after that night. Sometimes, when I lie in bed with the window cracked open, I hear the breeze moving through the trees. Sometimes, it whispers my name, "Let me in." I didn't sleep for weeks after that night at Clearwater Creek. I'd wake up gasping, ears straining for whispers that weren't there, heart racing with the memory of that pale face at the tent. I told myself it was over, that whatever we'd encountered stayed in those woods, but fear, like a deep splinter, never truly leaves. It just burrows deeper, waiting for the right moment to remind you it's still there. So when I heard about what happened at Frost Hollow Lake, I felt that old dread coil tight in my gut. The news called it a disappearance, but I recognized the signs. Missing campers, slashed tents, no tracks left behind. The details were too familiar, too similar. It was happening again. Olivia and Mark had been planning that trip to Frost Hollow for months. They were the kind of couple who thrived on adventure. Their friends Derek and Tina were more hesitant, but the promise of a remote, tranquil lake swayed them. No phones, no crowds, just untouched wilderness. The lake was legendary among locals. Stories of its stillness, its eerie quiet, its unshakable sense of isolation were passed around like campfire gossip. Most people brushed off the tales about the lake children as folklore, but legends, as Olivia would later realize, often hide truths best left undisturbed. The group arrived on a Friday morning. The lake greeted them with glassy silence. The surface reflected the sky with mirror precision, and the air felt unnaturally still. No birds, no insects, just the faint whisper of water against the shore. Olivia noticed the quiet immediately. "Where are the birds?" she asked, breaking the silence. Mark shrugged. "Maybe it's just too high up. Altitude messes with wildlife sometimes." She nodded but didn't quite believe it. Something about the silence felt wrong. The wind rustled the trees, but the sound seemed distant, like it came from somewhere far away. They set up camp near the shore. Derek and Tina pitched their tent a little closer to the water, enchanted by the lake's calm beauty. Olivia and Mark took the higher ground, closer to the tree line. By sunset, the lake glowed orange and pink, an undisturbed sheet of glass stretching toward the horizon. The first night passed without incident. They roasted hot dogs, teased each other about ghost stories, and marveled at the stars. Derek joked about the lake legends. "So, these lake children, what's the deal? They drown people or what?" Mark laughed. "Supposedly, they're spirits of kids who drowned here 100 years ago. People say they come out at night to find playmates. Just dumb folklore." Tina shuddered. "I hate ghost stories." Olivia forced a smile but couldn't shake the image. Spirits lurking beneath the surface, watching from the depths. By midnight, they turned in. Olivia lay in her sleeping bag, staring at the tent ceiling, while the lake's silence pressed against the fabric like a held breath. The wind picked up, rustling the branches above. The noise was faint but distinct, like laughter carried on the breeze. Children's laughter. She sat up, heart racing. Mark shifted beside her. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "What?" His voice was thick with sleep. "Kids? Laughing?" He blinked, then listened. The night was silent again. "You're just tired," he said, squeezing her hand. But Olivia stayed awake, waiting for the laughter to return. The next day, they paddled across the lake in kayaks. The water was icy beneath the surface, colder than expected for late summer. Derek splashed Tina, laughing as she yelped. Olivia trailed behind, scanning the shoreline. On the far side, she saw something odd, a figure standing in the trees. Too far to see clearly, but tall and thin, unmoving. She squinted and raised a hand to wave. The figure didn't respond. "Mark?" she called, voice tight. He followed her gaze, but saw nothing. "Probably just a tree," he said, but Olivia knew what she saw. That night, the laughter returned, louder this time, accompanied by the faint sound of splashing footsteps along the shore. Olivia unzipped the tent and shined her flashlight toward the water. The beam caught movement. 4 figures stood ankle-deep in the lake, small, childlike, barefoot. Their skin was pale, and their heads tilted at unnatural angles. The nearest one lifted its face to the light. Its eyes were hollow, black voids that absorbed the beam. Its mouth stretched into a wide grin as water dripped from its lips. "Mark!" Olivia gasped. He scrambled up beside her, swearing as his eyes landed on the figures. The children didn't move. The water around their legs remained still, undisturbed despite their presence. "What the hell?" Mark whispered. The grin on the nearest child's face widened. It raised one hand and pointed toward Derek and Tina's tent. The figures melted backward into the lake, disappearing without so much as a ripple. Olivia lunged for her boots. "We need to get to Derek and Tina." They raced across the campsite. The tent flap was unzipped, swaying in the breeze. Inside, sleeping bags lay empty. The lake's surface rippled faintly near the shore. Mark grabbed Olivia's arm. "Go to the car, now." They sprinted to the tree line, branches whipping against their skin. The path to the car felt endless. The wind carried faint, wet footsteps behind them. At the parking lot, the car sat untouched. Mark fumbled with the keys, hands slick with sweat. Olivia glanced back at the trail. Figures stood at the tree line. The children, closer now, smiling. The engine roared and Mark floored the gas. The figures didn't move as the headlights swept across them. Their hollow eyes followed the car until it vanished down the mountain road. At the nearest ranger station, Olivia and Mark burst in, breathless and wide-eyed. The ranger, a grizzled man in his 60s, listened without interrupting. When they finished, he picked up a radio and barked orders to a search team. 2 hours later, the rangers returned. No signs of Derek or Tina, no footprints near the water. The senior ranger pulled Olivia aside. "What did you see?" "Children," she said, voice trembling. "In the lake. Their eyes. They were empty." His face tightened. "They call them the lake children," he said after a long silence. "Lost souls, supposedly. The lake's been silent like this for decades. No birds, no insects. Just them." "How do you stop it?" she asked. He shook his head. "You don't. The lake takes who it wants." Mark and Olivia left Oregon the next day. Weeks passed, but the nightmares persisted. The sound of splashing footsteps haunted their nights. Then, one morning, Olivia checked her phone. A news alert. 2 campers missing at Frost Hollow Lake. The accompanying photo showed the shoreline near their campsite. In the water, half submerged, stood 4 figures. The one in front had Mark's eyes. The lake children had found their new playmates. And they were still looking for more. Fear doesn't fade, it festers. It hides in the corners of your mind, silent until something familiar stirs it awake. After what happened at Frost Hollow Lake, I told myself it was an isolated tragedy, an unexplainable nightmare for Olivia and Mark. But when I heard about the hikers on Shadow Ridge Trail, I felt that same dread bloom in my chest. Different state, different forest, but the same pattern. The same lingering presence. The local news reports said 4 college students went camping in the fog-laden woods of West Virginia and returned with haunted eyes and trembling voices. They talked about footsteps, missing belongings, and a figure watching from the mist. No one believed them, chalking it up to stress or bad edibles. But I knew better. The way Mia told the story later, I could hear the truth woven through her words. I met her a few months after it happened. The tremor in her voice never went away. Mia was 22 then. College student, psychology major, the kind of person who scoffed at ghost stories until that weekend on Shadow Ridge Trail. The hike was Caleb's idea. He'd read about the trail in some online forum dedicated to haunted locations. "Shadow Ridge is famous for its ghost sightings," he said, waving his phone at the group. Figures appear in the fog. People hear their names whispered in the trees. Classic nightmare fuel. Mia rolled her eyes, but Zoe, who thrived on social media clout, was intrigued. It could make for some killer TikToks, she said. We'll get a ton of views if we catch something creepy. Ethan, the fourth in their group, who was skeptical but along for the adventure. As long as there's beer, he said, tossing a case into the trunk. I'm game. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful. Just winding roads through dense forest and endless fog that thickened the higher they climbed. By the time they reached the parking lot, the sun was a pale blur behind swirling mist. The air was damp and cool, carrying the earthy scent of moss and wet leaves. No reception, Zoe complained, waving her phone. Perfect, Caleb said. Now it's just us and the ghosts. They set off into the woods, the trail narrow and hemmed in by towering pines. The fog muffled their footsteps and swallowed their voices. After an hour, Mia noticed something odd. Where are the birds? She asked. Caleb shrugged. Fog probably keeps them quiet. But it wasn't just the birds. The entire forest was unnaturally silent. No insects, no rustling leaves, no crack of branches. Just the dull crunch of their boots on damp earth and the soft whisper of mist curling around the trunks. Mia felt the hair on her arms rise. She caught Ethan glancing over his shoulder more than once. They reached the designated campsite by mid-afternoon, a small clearing bordered by pines that disappeared into the fog after 10 feet. The ground was spongy and cold beneath their tents. Mia unpacked while Zoe set up her phone to film. This is so creepy, Zoe said, panning her camera across the clearing. It's like something out of the Blair Witch Project. Except we won't die, Caleb said, forcing a laugh. Hopefully. Mia smiled, but the tension coiled tighter in her chest. The fog shifted and swirled beyond the fire pit. The trees stood like watching giants, their shapes distorted by the mist. They built a fire as darkness settled. Though the fog never lifted, the flames cast flickering shadows that danced along the mist, creating shapes that seemed to move just beyond the clearing. They drank beers, told ghost stories, and laughed a little too loudly. Mia checked her watch at 10 p.m. and realized how exhausted she felt. I'm turning in, she announced, standing and stretching. The others groaned, but agreed to follow suit. The tents were pitched side by side in the center of the clearing. Mia zipped herself into her sleeping bag and closed her eyes. The fog-room silence returned, pressing against the thin walls of the tent. She drifted into uneasy sleep. Somewhere in the night, a voice called her name. Mia! Her eyes snapped open. The tent was pitch black except for the faint glow of her phone screen. The voice came again, faint and stretched like a breath across the fog. Mia, come out. She turned toward Caleb's side of the tent, certain it was him playing a prank. Caleb, stop screwing around. Silence. She grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent. The beam sliced through the fog, illuminating the other tents, all zipped shut. The fire had burned down to embers. Beyond the clearing, the fog shifted unnaturally, swirling like breath on glass. Mia, over here! The voice was closer now, coming from the tree line. She swept the flashlight toward the sound. A figure stood just beyond the edge of the clearing, tall, motionless. Its features were indistinct through the mist, but she saw eyes, dark, reflective eyes that caught the beam. The figure tilted its head like a curious animal. Mia's heart slammed against her ribs. Who are you? She called. The figure didn't respond. It just stepped backward into the fog and disappeared. She ducked into the tent, zipped it closed, and shook Caleb awake. He groaned but sat up when he saw her face. There's someone out there, she whispered. Caleb rubbed his eyes and listened. The night was silent. You sure? Yes, it said my name. The color drained from his face. They woke Zoe and Ethan, who both dismissed it as a prank, until Mia described the figure. Okay, let's pack up in the morning, Caleb said. Just stay together tonight. No one argued. They tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. The fog seemed thicker, pressing against the tents like wet cotton. Mia checked her phone at 2:37 a.m. as the footsteps started. Soft, deliberate footsteps circled the tents. Mia held her breath. Caleb grabbed a hatchet from his pack. The footsteps stopped behind Mia's tent. The voice came again, low and raspy. Mia, let me in. Caleb lunged out of the tent with the hatchet, flashlight beam sweeping the fog. Mia followed. The figure stood 5 feet away. The light revealed its face, a pale, slack visage with hollow eyes and a mouth stretched into a grin too wide for its face. The fog thickened around its legs, swirling unnaturally, as if drawn to it. The figure didn't move. "Get away from us!" Caleb shouted, raising the hatchet. The figure tilted its head again. Its mouth moved. "Why?" Caleb swung. The hatchet sliced through the mist and hit nothing. The figure dissolved into the fog. "Go!" Mia screamed. They sprinted toward the trail. Zoe tripped, and Ethan yanked her up. The fog clung to them like wet blankets, distorting the trees and path. Mia looked over her shoulder. The figure was behind them. It glided through the mist without moving its legs, face still frozen in that unnatural grin. The trail seemed endless. Mia's lungs burned. The footsteps grew louder. The parking lot appeared through the fog like a miracle. They scrambled into the car. Caleb fumbled with the keys. "Move!" Mia shrieked. The headlights blazed across the lot as the engine roared to life. The figure stood in the beams just feet from the car. It raised one hand. The mouth moved again. "See you soon, Mia." Caleb slammed the gas. The car jerked forward, passing through the figure. The headlights showed empty mist. They didn't stop until they reached the next town. The police didn't believe them. Neither did their friends. Mia showed me a video from Zoe's phone, a shot of the clearing from earlier that night. In the background, the fog thickened behind Mia as she spoke to the camera. For a split second, a pale face appeared beside her shoulder, grinning at the lens before vanishing. Mia doesn't go hiking anymore, and she still gets texts from an unknown number every few weeks. No words, just a single photo. Shadow Ridge Trail swallowed in fog. In the distance, a figure stands, waiting. Some people say the wilderness is healing, that the quiet of the woods can soothe a restless mind. After hearing Mia's story about Shadow Ridge, I stopped believing that. Nature isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it's a predator, patient and watchful, waiting for you to let your guard down. Mia's voice still echoes in my mind. It knew my name. I thought that would be the last story like hers. I thought maybe these events were isolated, strange but disconnected. Then came Laura and Sam's trip to Ravenwood Plateau. Their encounter made it clear this thing, whatever it is, moves from place to place, and it never comes alone. Laura had always loved the outdoors. For her and Sam, their 10th wedding anniversary seemed like the perfect excuse to escape the city for a weekend. No kids, no phones, just their dog Rocky and the sprawling forests of Ravenwood Plateau. They booked a secluded campsite at the edge of the park, near a ridge known for its panoramic views. The ranger who checked them in warned them that few people ventured out that far. "Perfect," Laura said, smiling as she signed the permit. The ranger hesitated. "Just be careful out there. Wind gets strange near the plateau, and if Rocky starts acting weird, trust him." She laughed it off and pocketed the map he handed her. By the time they reached their campsite, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and red. The site was perfect, a small clearing surrounded by tall pines, the plateau's ridge just visible through the trees. They set up the tent while Rocky sniffed around the perimeter. His ears were up, tail stiff. He growled softly, pacing near the tree line. "What's with him?" Sam asked. "Probably smells a raccoon," Laura said, though Rocky usually wasn't this on edge. The fire crackled as darkness settled in. They cooked dinner and shared a bottle of wine while Rocky lay between them, eyes locked on the trees. The forest felt vast, the quiet broken only by the wind sifting through the branches. "You hear that?" Laura asked. Sam tilted his head. "The wind?" "No, it's like breathing." Sam laughed softly. "You're just spooked by Rocky." But she wasn't imagining it. Underneath the rustle of the leaves she heard it. A low, rhythmic sound. Shallow, measured breaths, like someone trying to stay quiet. She tightened her grip on Sam's arm. "Let's go to bed," she said. In the tent, Rocky lay across the entrance, growling at the darkness outside. Laura kept the flashlight close and stared at the thin nylon walls. The breathing sound faded, but the feeling of being watched lingered. She didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Laura found footprints in the damp soil near the tent. Not animal tracks. Human. Barefoot. The prints circled the tent twice before vanishing into the woods. "That's messed up," Sam said. "Maybe some hiker messing with us?" "There were no cars in the parking lot," Laura said. "And these prints, they're too big for a kid and too small for most adults," Rocky barked suddenly, staring toward the ridge. The fur along his back bristled. Laura shined the flashlight in that direction. For a split second, she saw movement. A figure slipping behind a tree, just beyond the reach of the beam. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Sam nodded. "Yeah, someone's out there. They spent the afternoon trying to convince themselves it was just a weird, random encounter. The ranger had warned them about animals after all. Maybe a curious drifter, or some prankster who lived nearby." The tension eased as the sun dipped low again. They sat by the fire while Rocky prowled the perimeter. The air grew colder, the wind carrying a sharp, metallic tang. Laura kept glancing toward the tree line. "Let's pack up tomorrow morning," she said. Sam agreed without hesitation. That night, Laura woke to Rocky barking frantically. His growls were deeper, more guttural than she'd ever heard. The flashlight showed the tent flap intact, but the dog's attention was fixed outside. The footsteps started soon after. Soft, pacing, circling the tent. The breathing followed, louder this time, rasping and irregular. Sam sat up. "What the hell is that?" The footsteps stopped directly outside the tent flap. Then came the voice. "Let me in." Laura's breath caught in her throat. The words were slow, each syllable dragged across dry vocal cords. Rocky lunged, barking wildly. The voice spoke again, louder. "Let me in!" The zipper twitched. Sam scrambled for the hatchet. Laura aimed the flashlight at the door. Shadows shifted against the fabric, stretching unnaturally, bending in ways that didn't make sense. The zipper tugged downward an inch, then stopped. Rocky lunged again, teeth bared. The shadow retreated. The footsteps faded into the woods. They bolted from the tent, dragging their packs to the car. Rocky barked furiously as they threw the gear into the trunk. Laura's hands shook as she jammed the key into the ignition. The headlights cut through the trees. The figure stood 20 feet away, tall and thin, its skin pale as bone. Its eyes reflected the headlights like animal eyes, but the mouth was human, too human, stretched into a grin. Rocky growled from the back seat, pressing himself against the window. "Drive," Sam said, voice cracking. Laura slammed the gas. The car fishtailed, tires spitting gravel as it tore down the forest road. The headlights caught the figure again, standing further down the path. The engine screamed as Laura pushed the car faster. Branches scraped the sides like grasping fingers. The road twisted, the trees thickening around them. Sam checked the rearview mirror. His face went white. "It's running after us," he whispered. Laura risked a glance. The figure sprinted through the trees alongside the car. Its limbs moved awkwardly, unnaturally, joints bending the wrong way. Its mouth never lost that grin. "Faster!" Sam shouted. The car hit a rut, jolting them hard enough to crack Laura's ribs against the steering wheel. The headlights caught the campground entrance sign. She floored the pedal and burst onto the main road. The figure stopped at the tree line, watching as they sped away. They drove straight to the nearest town and parked under the blinding lights of a gas station. Rocky whimpered, tail between his legs. Sam leaned forward, forehead resting against the dashboard. Laura called the ranger station. An hour later, an older man arrived in a marked truck. He listened to their story without interruption. When Laura mentioned the voice, he paled. "Let me guess," he said softly. "It said, 'Let me in'?" Laura's throat tightened. "How did you know?" The ranger rubbed his eyes. "We've had reports like yours for years. Always the same thing. Footsteps, the voice. One camper claimed the footprints around his tent ended in claw marks." "What the hell is it?" Sam asked. The ranger shrugged. "Nobody knows, but it follows people, and if Rocky hadn't been there..." He didn't finish the sentence. Laura turned to look at Rocky. The dog stared out the window, ears flat, body trembling. The ranger wrote down their names and gave them his number. "If you see it again, call me, and don't go back to Ravenwood." They drove home at sunrise, too afraid to stop along the way. 3 nights later, Laura woke to Rocky growling at the bedroom window. The streetlight outside illuminated the sidewalk. The figure stood beneath the lamppost, grinning up at the house. It raised a hand and tapped on the glass with one crooked finger. Laura whispered Sam's name. The voice came from just beyond the glass. "Let me in." They moved the next morning. They never found Rocky. The front door was locked, the windows sealed, but the back door was wide open, muddy footprints leading from the woods and back again. The last thing they heard before leaving town was from a neighbor who swore she saw a pale man walking down their street the night before. That he wasn't alone, she said. A large dog with empty eyes walked beside him. They haven't gone near the woods since, but Laura still hears Rocky's growl late at night. And sometimes, just before dawn, the voice returns. "Let me in." After Laura and Sam's story, I was sure I understood the pattern. I thought whatever haunted those forests, those whispering voices, those hollow-eyed figures, would stay in the wilderness. That was where it thrived, among the trees and shadows. But when the story of Lost Creek campsite surfaced, I realized how wrong I was. The wilderness doesn't stay in the woods. Sometimes it follows you home. Mike had always loved the outdoors. After his wife passed away the previous winter, he'd become more distant. His teenage kids, Dylan and Casey, noticed it immediately. He was quieter, more withdrawn. So when Mike suggested a weekend camping trip to Lost Creek campsite in Tennessee to reconnect, both teens agreed, though Dylan wasn't thrilled about the idea. 3 days with no Wi-Fi, Dylan groaned as they packed the car. "It won't kill you," Mike said, forcing a smile. "It'll be good for us." Lost Creek campsite was miles from the nearest town, tucked away in a thick forest where the mountains cradled a winding river. The road to the campsite was rough, barely more than gravel with deep ruts from years of erosion. Dylan sat in the back seat with his headphones in, while Casey read a book in the passenger seat. As they drove deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to lean closer to the road. The sunlight dimmed beneath the canopy, turning the forest floor into a patchwork of shadows. "This place is pretty remote," Casey said, glancing at the dense trees. "Yeah, that's the idea," Mike said. The road ended at a small clearing marked by a wooden sign, "Lost Creek Campsite, Nature's Hidden Gem." Beneath the carved letters, someone had etched in shaky handwriting, "Don't stay past sunset." Casey nudged Dylan. "Look at that." He rolled his eyes. "Probably just a prank. People love to freak out campers." Mike hesitated before turning off the engine. He stared at the warning a moment too long, then shook his head. "Come on, let's get set up." They pitched the tent near the riverbank. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and pine. Birds called from the branches overhead, their songs crisp and clear. For the first few hours, everything felt normal, peaceful, even. They cooked hot dogs over the fire and laughed as Casey teased Dylan about his phone withdrawal. By nightfall, the forest shifted, the birds stopped singing, the wind died down, the air thickened, the silence pressing against them like a weighted blanket. Mike poked at the fire. "Hear that?" Dylan frowned. "I don't hear anything." "Exactly," Mike said. "It's too quiet." The crackle of the fire became the only sound. Casey rubbed her arms, suddenly cold. "Let's just go to bed," she said. The tent felt smaller than before. Mike lay between the kids, listening to the silence beyond the thin nylon walls. He told himself the quiet was normal in remote woods, but then came the tapping, soft, steady, right against the side of the tent. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. Mike turned on his flashlight and pointed it toward the sound. The beam illuminated the fabric wall. Nothing there. "Dad," Casey whispered, voice trembling. "Shh," Mike said. The tapping moved around the tent, first by Casey's side, then behind Dylan's head, then to the front, near the entrance. The taps were deliberate, like someone tracing a finger along the fabric. The flashlight beam caught a shadow just beyond the door. A figure standing motionless. "Who's out there?" Mike barked. The shadow shifted. A voice answered. "Let me in." The words were dry, almost childlike. Casey whimpered. Dylan scrambled for his phone, but there was no signal. Mike gripped the hatchet he'd brought for chopping wood. Get away from here, he said. Silence. Then, footsteps crunched away from the tent, moving toward the woods. They sat in terrified silence until dawn. The next morning, they found footprints around the tent, bare footprints that started near the trees and circled the tent repeatedly. Near the entrance, the impressions were deeper, like someone had stood there for a long time, listening. Mike checked the ground near the riverbank. The footprints led there and stopped abruptly, as if the person had walked straight into the water. "Dad?" Dylan called from the trees. "Come look at this." Mike followed his voice. Dylan pointed to an old, weathered notebook wedged in the crook of a tree. The pages were swollen from rain and age, but the writing was still legible. The first few entries were mundane. Dates, weather reports, fishing notes. Then the tone changed. "He watches me every night, the man with the empty eyes. The voice whispered by the tent last night, asked me to let him in. I said no, it didn't like that. The ranger told me to leave. I should have listened. He's here again. Closer this time. I can hear him breathing." The last entry was dated 10 years earlier. "He's coming for me tonight." Mike closed the notebook and shoved it in his pack. "We're leaving," he said. "But we just got here," Dylan protested. "Now!" Mike snapped. They packed in minutes, hearts pounding with every crack of a branch. As Mike shoved the tent into the trunk, he noticed the footprints again, leading from the tree with the journal toward their campsite. The drive down the mountain was nerve-wracking. Mike kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone standing in the road. The shadows between the trees shifted, but nothing emerged. They reached the main highway by noon, and didn't stop until they reached a motel an hour away. The tension finally eased as they sat in the brightly lit room, curtains drawn shut. "That was insane," Dylan said. "That voice? You heard it, right?" Mike nodded. "Yeah, I heard it." Casey hugged her knees. "What was it?" "I don't know," Mike said. "But we're safe now." That night, around 2 a.m., Mike woke to a faint tapping at the window. The motel was on the second floor. His stomach turned to ice. He sat up slowly and looked at the window. A pale face stared through the glass. The mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. The eyes were black voids, reflecting nothing. The figure raised a hand and tapped again. Tap, tap, tap. Pause. Tap, tap, tap. Mike stood, body trembling, and stepped toward the window. The figure's grin widened. Its mouth moved without sound. He unlocked the window. The figure's smile faltered, and it cocked its head, confused. Its mouth moved again, this time loud enough to hear. "Let me in." Mike's fingers hovered over the latch. His heart hammered in his chest. The voice was gentle, persuasive. He thought of the footprints, the journal, the tent. He took a step back. The figure's smile vanished. Its lips stretched into something hateful, skin cracking along the jaw. It slammed a hand against the glass. The window shuddered, spiderweb fractures crawling across the pane. Mike turned and ran to the kids' room. He yanked them from bed. "Get to the car!" he shouted. Casey screamed as the window shattered behind them. They fled the motel, racing through the parking lot. Behind them, footsteps slapped against the pavement. Dylan fumbled with the car keys. The figure appeared at the edge of the lot, walking slowly now. Its limbs twisted unnaturally as it stalked toward them. The car engine roared. Dylan threw it into gear, tires squealing as they sped away. Mike didn't breathe until the figure disappeared into the distance. They drove through the night and didn't stop until sunrise. The next day, news broke about a motel break-in. The description matched what they'd seen. Mike never slept near a window again. Months passed without incident. Then, one night, Mike woke to tapping at the back door. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. He crept to the door and peered through the peephole. No one was there. The voice came from the other side, whispering through the wood. "Let me in, Mike. I found you." He never opened the door. But the tapping never stopped. The wilderness is a place of beauty and wonder, a sanctuary from the noise of modern life. But, as these 6 stories have shown, it's also a place where the unknown can take root and grow. When we venture into nature, we often forget that we're entering something ancient, something that doesn't always welcome us. The woods, the water, the fog, they've been here long before us, and sometimes They hold secrets that refuse to stay buried. If there's one lesson to take from these tales, it's this: trust your instincts. Every person who shared their story had a moment when something felt wrong. A whisper on the wind, footsteps circling the tent, a figure at the tree line. Fear isn't just irrational panic, it's an ancient survival instinct we often dismiss. If you feel like you're being watched, or if the woods go unnaturally silent, listen to that feeling. It's better to leave and feel silly later than to stay and discover you should have trusted your gut. Never underestimate the power of preparation. Camping isn't just about packing snacks and roasting marshmallows. Make sure your campsite is safe, that you're familiar with the area, and that you always have a way to call for help if needed. And if your dog growls at the dark or your child says they hear someone whispering by the tent, don't brush it off. Animals and children often sense what we rationalize away. And then there's the voice. And the "let me in," it's an invitation, a plea, a manipulation. It doesn't matter if the voice knows your name or sounds like someone familiar. Never open the door, never step outside. Never invite the unknown into your space. The wilderness doesn't need an invitation. It already surrounds you. But whatever hides within it, that does. Most of all, remember that isolation, while often sought for peace, can make you vulnerable. Remote campsites, empty trails, and silent lakes offer solitude, but they also remove you from the safety of others. Always tell someone where you're going, and if you come across strange markings, weathered journals or warnings carved into old wooden signs, heed them. Legends are often rooted in forgotten truths. To those who've made it this far, thank you for joining us on this chilling journey through whispers in the wilderness. Your support fuels the stories we tell and reminds us that the unknown is always closer than we think. If you've ever experienced something strange while camping, hiking, or simply being in nature, feel free to share it in the comments. We're always listening. And sometimes, the woods are too. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you want more tales that make you think twice before stepping into the dark. This is Enigma of the Unknown, signing off. Until next time, when the shadows stir and the whispers return, stay safe, stay vigilant, and if you hear a voice at night saying, "Let me in," don't. Good night.